I lifted my bride's veil to kiss her, and the woman standing beneath it was not the woman I had asked to marry. It was my ex-wife, and she was crying so hard her whole body trembled, and 200 guests gasped as one, and in that single frozen second I understood that every plan I had made for that day, maybe for the rest of my life, had just come apart in front of everyone I loved. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. If you believe that people can change, that broken families can be healed, that forgiveness is stronger than pride, and that second chances are worth fighting for, then please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Our community grows because people like you believe these stories matter. Now let me take you back to where it all began, so you can understand how a wedding day turned into the most important reckoning of my life. My name is Grant Whitfield, and I was 38 years old on the morning I stood at the altar of St. Augustine's, a stone chapel with tall windows that let the June sunlight pour gold across the aisle. I had rented that chapel because my mother was married there, and because it faced east, and I liked the idea of starting a marriage with the sun rising behind me rather than setting. I had spent 11 months planning that day with a woman named Priya Sandoval, though by the time you finish this story you will understand that name matters less than what she represented to me, which was a fresh start after the wreckage of a marriage I thought had ended for good 3 years earlier. That earlier marriage was to a woman named Elaine Carver. Elaine and I met in our 20s, when I was still delivering pizzas to pay for community college and she was working the register at a bookstore 2 doors down. She used to slip bookmarks into the pizza boxes when she knew it was my shift, little quotes copied out in her handwriting, sometimes funny, sometimes achingly tender. I still remember the first one. It said that the bravest thing a person can do is stay soft in a world that keeps asking them to harden. I fell in love with her before I ever learned her last name, because I fell in love with the handwriting first, and then the woman who owned it. We married when I was 26. For the first 4 years, our life together felt like the kind of thing people write songs about: small apartment, big dreams, the two of us against the world. Elaine wanted to be a teacher, and she poured herself into night classes while working days, and I was proud of her in a way that felt like standing a little taller every time I said her name. I had started a small contracting business, fixing up old houses and flipping them, and slowly it grew from 1 crew to 3, and slowly the money that had been tight became comfortable, and then good, and then very good. I want to be honest with you here, because this is a story about honesty costing everything and also saving everything. The truth is that success changed me in ways I did not notice while they were happening. I started working later. I started taking calls during dinner. I started measuring my worth by the size of the houses I built rather than the size of the love I was building at home. Elaine tried to tell me. She told me gently at first, and then not so gently, and by the 5th year of our marriage she was telling me through silence, which is the loudest way a person can speak. We lost a baby in our 6th year together. I do not say this to make you feel sorry for us, only because it is the truth, and because grief either brings 2 people closer or it finds every crack already in the foundation and widens it until the whole structure gives way. For us, it was the second thing. Elaine wanted to talk about it, to cry about it, to sit with it together on the porch some evenings and just exist in the sadness side by side. I did not know how to do that. I had grown up in a house where feelings were treated like whether you waited out, not whether you stood in together, and so I did what I knew, which was to bury myself in work until the ache dulled into something I could ignore. I told myself I was providing for her. I told myself the new houses, the bigger bank account, the growing company, were all proof of my love, when really they had become my hiding place. By our 8th year, Elaine had stopped leaving bookmarks. She had stopped waiting up. One night in October, under a porch light that had been flickering for weeks because I kept meaning to fix it and never did, she told me she was leaving. She did not shout. She did not cry, at least not in front of me. She said that she loved me still, and that was the part that broke me most, because if she had hated me I could have hated myself less. She said she could not keep loving a man who was never actually in the room with her even when he was sitting across the table. She packed 2 suitcases that night and stayed with her sister, and within a year the divorce was final, and within 2 years I had convinced myself that it had been a mutual failure, a simple incompatibility, two good people who wanted different things. It took me a long time, much longer than it should have, to admit that this was a lie I told myself so I would not have to feel the full weight of what I had done. I met Priya about a year after the divorce was finalized. She was warm and funny and endlessly patient with the parts of me that were still healing, or at least still pretending to heal. She worked as an event coordinator, which meant she noticed details I never would have thought of, the way a room's lighting could change how people felt, the way a certain song could make strangers cry at the right moment in a ceremony. She was, in almost every way, easy to love. I want to be fair to her in this story, because she deserves fairness, even though she is not the center of it. She never did anything wrong. She simply became engaged to a man who had not yet finished grieving a marriage he had ended himself, which is one of the cruelest kinds of unfinished business there is. We got engaged on a beach in early autumn, and Priya cried happy tears, and I remember feeling something that I told myself was joy but that, looking back, was closer to relief. I had proof, finally, that I could be loved again, that I had not permanently broken something in myself the way I feared I had. We planned the wedding together, or rather, she planned it and I nodded along gratefully, because it was easier to hand over the details than to sit with why certain choices made my chest tighten in ways I could not explain. She chose St. Augustine's because I mentioned once, in passing, that my mother had been married there, and she thought it would be meaningful. She had no way of knowing that Elaine and I had also once talked about getting married there, back when we were young and broke and dreaming, before either of us had any money or any children we would lose or any silence that would grow between us like ivy over brick. I did not tell Priya that. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself that a chapel is just a chapel, that stone and stained glass do not remember who stood inside them, that love does not have geography. I was wrong about all of it, though I would not understand how wrong until the day of the wedding itself. The morning of the ceremony, I woke up before my alarm, the way you do on days that feel too large for ordinary sleep to hold. I stood at the window of the hotel room where my groomsmen and I had stayed the night before, watching the sun come up over a parking lot that somehow looked beautiful in that early light, the way anything can look beautiful if you are desperate enough for the day ahead to be good. My best man, a contractor named Wes Delacroix who had worked with me since the early days of my business, handed me a cup of coffee and told me I looked like a man walking to his own execution rather than his own wedding. I laughed it off. I told him I was just nervous, the way every groom is nervous. I did not tell him that I had dreamed, the night before, not of Priya, but of Elaine, standing in a doorway with a bookmark in her hand, and that I had woken up with my chest aching in a way that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with a grief I had never properly let myself feel. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon, and by noon the chapel was already filling with guests, women in pastel dresses fanning themselves with programs, men loosening their collars in the June heat, children weaving between the pews while their parents tried and failed to keep them still. My mother sat in the front row on the groom's side, dabbing at her eyes before the ceremony had even begun, the way mothers do. Priya's family had flown in from 3 different states, and her father, a retired Navy officer named Desmond Sandoval, kept checking his watch and adjusting his tie with the nervous energy of a man determined to walk his only daughter down the aisle without breaking down in front of 200 witnesses. I stood at the altar in a charcoal suit that Priya had picked out for me, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, feeling the particular kind of vulnerability that comes from being watched by everyone you have ever loved at the exact moment you are about to promise your life to someone. The string quartet in the corner began to play, and the doors at the back of the chapel opened, and the whole room rose to its feet in that soft rustling way crowds do when something sacred is about to happen. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the story that changed everything, and I think it deserves to be told slowly, the way it happened to me, second by unbearable second. The bride came down the aisle on her father's arm, dressed in white, a veil covering her face, the sunlight from the tall windows falling across her in bars of gold and shadow as she passed each pew. I remember thinking, in the strange detached way your mind works during moments too large to process fully, that she seemed shorter than I expected, that her walk was different, slower, more careful, as though she were counting each step. I told myself it was nerves. I told myself the light was playing tricks on me. I told myself 100 small lies in the space of 30 seconds because the alternative, the truth trying to surface in my gut, was too enormous to face standing at an altar in front of 200 people. Her father placed her hand in mine and stepped back to sit beside his wife, and I remember his eyes, how strange they looked, wet and searching, fixed on me with an intensity that had nothing to do with a father's ordinary sentimental tears. The officiant began to speak. I do not remember a single word he said. I was looking at the veil, at the shape of the face beneath it, a shape that some old and stubborn part of my heart was already recognizing even as my mind refused to let the thought fully form. When the officiant finally said the words I had been waiting my whole adult life to hear, that I might now kiss my bride, my hands were shaking as I reached for the edge of that veil, and some part of me already knew, the way you know a storm is coming before the first drop of rain falls, that I was about to step into something that would break the day wide open. I lifted the veil. And there, beneath layers of white lace, her mascara long since ruined, her lips trembling, her whole body shaking with a grief and a fury she could no longer contain, stood Elaine Carver. My ex-wife. Not Priya. Elaine. For one endless moment, nobody in that chapel made a sound. Then the sound came all at once, a collective gasp that rose from 200 throats like a single wounded animal, chairs creaking as people leaned forward, someone's phone clattering to the stone floor, a child somewhere near the back beginning to cry at the sudden tension in the air. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Wes, standing beside me as best man, took one step forward and then froze, as though his body could not decide whether this called for intervention or simply witness. And Desmond Sandoval, the man I had believed to be Priya's father, sat in the front row with his head bowed, his shoulders shaking, and I understood in that instant that he had known. That everyone connected to this moment except me had known something I did not. I want you to understand what it feels like to have the ground disappear beneath you in front of everyone who has ever loved you. It is not like falling. It is like the world simply forgets, for a moment, that gravity exists, and you float there in the horror of not understanding, waiting for someone to explain what has just become of your life. Elaine looked at me, and her tears were not the tears of a woman who had done something cruel for the pleasure of it. They were the tears of someone who had been carrying something so heavy for so long that she had finally collapsed under its weight in the worst possible place, at the worst possible moment, in front of the worst possible audience. She opened her mouth to speak, and her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, cracked and raw, the voice of someone who has rehearsed 1,000 different ways to say something and found, in the actual moment, that none of the rehearsals mattered anymore. She told me that Priya was not coming. That Priya had asked her, 3 days earlier, to be the one to tell me, because Priya could not do it herself, because Priya had discovered something that made it impossible for her to stand at that altar and marry me with a clear conscience, and that something was a truth Elaine had been hiding from everyone, including herself, for months. I need to back up here and tell you what had actually happened, because I did not learn the full shape of it until much later that day, pieced together from broken conversations in the chapel's side room, from Wes's frantic explanations, from a conversation with Desmond that would end up changing the direction of my entire life. Priya, in her work as an event coordinator, had crossed paths with Elaine 4 months before the wedding. It was, of all things, an accident of geography. Elaine had moved back to our city after 2 years away, working now as a full-time teacher, the dream she had once sacrificed for our marriage finally realized on the other side of our divorce. She had been hired to arrange the classroom decorations for a school fundraising gala, and Priya had been the coordinator managing the event, and somewhere between hanging streamers and organizing centerpieces, the two women had gotten to talking, and Elaine had mentioned my name in passing, not knowing that the woman she was speaking to was engaged to marry me in a matter of months. I have thought about this moment more than almost any other in this whole story, the strange cruelty and mercy of coincidence, the way the universe sometimes forces a reckoning through the most unlikely doors. Priya did not confront Elaine that day. She went home instead and sat with the knowledge for weeks, turning it over, watching me more closely than I realized, noticing the way I sometimes went quiet at the mention of my first marriage, the way I flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever anyone mentioned children or the years before I turned 30. She began to suspect, in the sensitive and perceptive way she had, that I had never actually grieved my divorce. That I had simply replaced one relationship with another the way a man replaces a broken window, quickly, efficiently, without ever examining what caused the crack in the first place. 2 months before the wedding, Priya reached out to Elaine directly. Not out of jealousy, not out of cruelty, but out of a kind of desperate honesty that I now understand took more courage than almost anything I have ever witnessed. She wanted to know the truth about our marriage, not my version of it, not the sanitized story I had told about mutual incompatibility, but the real story, the one with all its jagged, unflattering edges. Elaine resisted at first. She told me later that she felt it was not her place, that whatever happened between her and me was ours alone to carry, that raking through old wreckage for the benefit of the woman who was about to marry her ex-husband felt like a betrayal of some unspoken rule about how these things are supposed to work. But Priya persisted, gently, and eventually Elaine told her everything. About the years of silence. About the baby we lost and never spoke of again. About the way I had disappeared into work rather than face grief, rather than face her, rather than face myself. And here is the part that undid me most completely when I finally understood it. Elaine did not tell this story to hurt me. She told it because Priya asked a question that Elaine could not, in good conscience, refuse to answer honestly. Priya asked her whether she believed I had ever truly dealt with what happened between us, or whether I had simply moved on the way a man changes the channel when a program becomes too painful to watch. And Elaine, crying, told her the truth. She said she did not know. She said that in 3 years, I had never once called her to talk, never once apologized properly, never once acknowledged out loud the specific ways I had failed her, only ever offered the vague and comfortable narrative that things simply had not worked out. She said she worried, genuinely worried, out of some lingering care for the man she had once loved more than anyone, that I was about to marry a wonderful woman while still carrying the exact same wound, unhealed, waiting to reopen. Priya spent the next several weeks watching me differently after that conversation, testing small things, bringing up our old wedding venue idea to see how I would react, mentioning children in passing to watch my face, and each time she said later, in a letter she eventually wrote me, she saw the same thing. A flicker of something buried and unresolved, quickly smoothed over, quickly hidden. She loved me. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters, and because it is the truth. But she loved me enough to refuse to become the next chapter in a story I had never finished writing honestly. 3 days before the wedding, she came to a decision that I still consider one of the bravest things anyone has ever done on my behalf, even though it devastated me at the time. She could not stand up in that chapel and let me make promises to her while I was still, in some unspoken corner of my heart, making unfinished promises to someone else. But she also could not simply cancel the wedding by phone call or text message, could not let 200 guests arrive to an empty altar and a vague explanation. She believed, and I have come to believe she was right, that I deserved to face the truth in person, fully, without the comfort of avoidance that I had built my whole adult life around. So she asked Elaine to do something almost unthinkable. She asked her to stand in that chapel, in her place, wearing her veil, so that when I lifted it expecting to kiss my future, I would instead be forced to look directly at my past, at the woman I had truly never stopped loving in the ways that mattered most, at the wound I had spent 3 years pretending had healed on its own. I have asked myself many times since that day whether this was a fair thing to do to me, to Elaine, to everyone gathered in those pews expecting a wedding and receiving instead a reckoning. I have decided, after a great deal of reflection, that fairness was never really the point. Some truths cannot be delivered gently. Some wounds have to be reopened publicly before they can finally close correctly. Priya gave me, in the cruelest possible packaging, the most generous gift anyone has ever given me, which was the chance to stop lying to myself in front of everyone who loved me, so that the lie could no longer survive. I did not understand any of this in the chapel itself, of course. In the chapel, all I understood was chaos. Guests were murmuring, some standing to leave in confusion, others frozen in their seats, unsure whether to feel scandalized or heartbroken or both. My mother had made her way to the aisle and was gripping the back of a pew for support. Wes had put a hand on my shoulder, and I remember shaking it off, not out of anger at him but because I could not bear to be touched in that moment, could not bear any point of contact with the world while my entire understanding of my own life rearranged itself in real time. Elaine, still in that borrowed veil now pushed back from her tear-streaked face, reached out and touched my hand, and told me, in a voice trembling but somehow steadier than I felt, that she had not wanted to be the one to do this to me. That she had argued with Priya for 2 full days, told her it was cruel, told her it would humiliate everyone involved, told her that some things are better left buried. But Priya had said something that Elaine repeated to me there at the altar, something that I have carried with me every day since. Priya had said that burying the truth is not the same as healing it, and that a wedding built on a grave will always eventually sink. I do not remember walking out of that chapel. Wes told me later that he guided me by the arm through a side door into a small stone antechamber where brides traditionally waited before ceremonies, a room with a single narrow window and an old wooden bench, and that I sat there for nearly 20 minutes without speaking a single word while the guests outside slowly dispersed in stunned, whispering clusters. My mother came in at some point and sat beside me, and I remember finally breaking, not in the dramatic way you might expect, but quietly, my head in my hands, my shoulders shaking with a grief 3 years overdue. Elaine came in later, after most of the guests had gone, after Desmond had quietly explained to the remaining stragglers that the wedding would not be happening and that everyone's understanding and discretion would be deeply appreciated. She had removed the veil by then and changed into the simple gray dress she had worn beneath it, and she stood in the doorway of that small stone room looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face in years, something that was not quite forgiveness yet, but was no longer only anger either. She asked if she could sit down, and I nodded, and for a long time neither of us said anything at all, because there are some silences that are healing rather than harmful, and I think that was one of them. When she finally spoke, she told me she was not there to reopen old wounds for the sake of pain. She told me she had built a good life in the 2 years since our divorce, that she had her classroom now, full of 8-year-olds who called her Miss Carver and brought her dandelions from the playground as though they were the finest bouquets in the world, that she had found a version of peace she had not known she was capable of. She told me she had not come to that chapel hoping to stop my wedding out of some lingering desire to reclaim what we had lost. She had come because Priya asked her to, and because somewhere beneath the anger she still carried about how our marriage had ended, she genuinely did not want to see me repeat the same mistake with someone else, someone who deserved better than a man still running from his own grief. I asked her, my voice barely functioning, whether she still loved me. It was, I think, the most honest question I had asked another human being in years, maybe in my entire adult life, and I asked it not because I expected a particular answer but because I finally wanted the truth more than I wanted comfort. She was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her hands, and then she told me that love, real love, does not simply vanish because 2 people stop being married. She said she still loved the man I had been in our best years, the one who used to leave the porch light on for her even after long nights at work, the one who had once driven 4 hours in a snowstorm because she mentioned, offhandedly, that she was craving a specific kind of soup from a diner near her childhood home. She said she loved that man deeply, and that she grieved him too, because somewhere along the way, he had disappeared into someone who built beautiful houses and left his own heart in disrepair. I told her, and this was the first time I had ever said it out loud to another person, that I was sorry. Not the vague, deflecting sorry I had offered during our divorce, the one that had really meant I regret how this looks rather than I regret what I did. I told her I was sorry for disappearing into work while she grieved our child alone. I told her I was sorry for treating money and success as substitutes for presence. I told her I was sorry that it had taken losing her, and then very nearly losing another woman I cared for deeply, in the most humiliating way possible, for me to finally understand what I had broken and why. She cried again then, but it was a different kind of crying than the kind she had done beneath that veil, something more like release than grief. She told me that hearing me say it, really say it, plainly and without excuses, meant more to her than I could possibly understand, because for 3 years she had wondered whether I even knew what I had done, whether I had simply filed our marriage away as an unfortunate incompatibility, the way I apparently had, without ever reckoning with my own part in its ending. We sat in that small stone room for nearly 2 hours while the chapel emptied around us, while catering staff quietly began packing away food that would never be eaten by wedding guests, while somewhere outside my mother explained things to relatives in low, careful tones. Wes eventually came to check on us, and seeing that we were, against every expectation, having the most honest conversation either of us had had in years, he simply nodded and closed the door softly behind him, giving us the privacy that 200 guests had unwittingly witnessed the beginning of. I want to pause here and tell you something important, something I think matters more than any twist in this story. What happened next was not some tidy fairy tale reunion, not some instant reconciliation where Elaine and I fell back into each other's arms and lived happily ever after as though the intervening years had never happened. Real healing is rarely that fast, and I would be lying to you, after telling you how much I have come to value the truth, if I pretended otherwise. Elaine left the chapel that day still uncertain about many things, still protective of the peace she had built for herself, still unwilling to simply hand her heart back to a man who had broken it once already. And I do not blame her for that. I would not have trusted me either, not yet, not without proof that the man sitting across from her in that stone room was capable of sustained change rather than a single dramatic moment of clarity born from public humiliation. What did happen, in the weeks that followed, was something slower and, I think, ultimately more meaningful. I reached out to Priya first, because I owed her that above everyone else. I found her at her apartment 3 days after the non-wedding, and I did not go there to beg her to reconsider, because some part of me already understood that what she had done, however painful, had been an act of profound love and honesty rather than betrayal. I went there to thank her. She opened the door with red-rimmed eyes and a guarded expression, clearly braced for anger, and when I told her instead that I understood why she had done what she did, and that I was grateful for it even as it had gutted me, she began to cry in a way that told me she had been carrying enormous guilt over the decision, wondering whether she had done something unforgivable rather than something necessary. We talked for a long time that afternoon, and by the end of it, we both understood that whatever we had built together over those 11 months had been real and good, but that it had also been built, on my part at least, on a foundation I had not finished repairing. We parted that day not as enemies but as two people who had genuinely tried to build something together and had discovered, through the hardest possible circumstances, that the timing and the truth of things simply were not aligned. I still think of her with gratitude. I believe, wherever she is now, she deserves every bit of the happiness she gave up that day for the sake of doing right by both of us. After that, I did something I had never done in my adult life. I sought out a therapist, a quiet, unhurried man named Oliver Bramwell who had an office above a bakery downtown, and I spent months, real months, sitting in his small sunlit office working through the parts of myself I had spent a decade avoiding. We talked about my childhood, about a father who believed emotions were a weakness to be managed rather than a language to be spoken, about the way I had learned, long before I ever met Elaine, that busyness was the safest hiding place from feeling anything too deeply. We talked about the baby Elaine and I had lost, and for the first time since it happened, I let myself grieve that loss fully, sitting on Oliver's worn leather couch, weeping for a child I had never met and had never properly allowed myself to mourn because mourning had felt, to the man I was then, like losing control. I did not reach out to Elaine again for nearly 4 months after the wedding that never happened. I wanted, this time, for any reconciliation between us to be built on something more solid than the emotional wreckage of a single dramatic afternoon. I wanted to become, as much as it was possible, a man worth trusting again, not because I expected her to take me back, but because I owed it to myself, and to her, and honestly to Priya as well, to become someone capable of showing up fully in whatever relationships came next in my life, whether they included Elaine or not. During those 4 months, I also did something that surprised even me. I began volunteering, 2 evenings a week, at a community center that offered support groups for people navigating grief and loss, not as a counselor, since I had no qualifications for that, but simply as someone who helped set up chairs, brew coffee, and occasionally, when invited, share a piece of my own story with people who were sitting exactly where I had once sat, silently drowning in feelings I did not know how to name. I discovered something there that changed the shape of the rest of my life. I discovered that the work I had once buried myself in to avoid feeling anything could instead become work that helped other people feel less alone in their own grief, and there is a strange, quiet grace in that kind of redemption, taking the very tool you once used to hide and turning it instead into a bridge toward other people's healing. It was at that community center, actually, that I ran into Elaine again, though not by the kind of coincidence that had brought her and Priya together months earlier. She had started attending, on her own initiative, a weekly gathering for people processing pregnancy loss, something she told me later she had needed for years but had never given herself permission to seek out while we were married, because grieving openly had never felt safe in our house. I saw her from across the community room one Tuesday evening, sitting in a circle of folding chairs, and for a moment I considered leaving quietly before she noticed me, worried that my presence there would feel like an intrusion into a space she had built for her own healing. But she saw me, and instead of looking away, she offered a small, tired smile, the kind of smile that carries within it both the memory of pain and the beginning of something gentler. We did not fall into each other's arms that night either. Healing, real healing, is patient in a way that romantic stories often are not, and I think that patience is part of what made whatever came next between us actually last, rather than becoming another beautiful thing built too quickly on a foundation that had not yet set. We started, slowly, having coffee after those Tuesday evening groups, not as a couple, but as two people who had once loved each other and were now, separately, learning how to carry their grief without letting it define every silence between them. We talked about the baby we had lost in ways we never had while married, out loud, without either of us flinching or changing the subject or disappearing into a work call. We talked about her classroom of 8-year-olds and the dandelion bouquets, about my volunteer evenings at the community center, about all the small, unremarkable, beautiful details of two separate lives slowly finding their way back towards something shared. It took nearly a year, from the day I lifted that veil in shock and grief, to the day I finally worked up the courage to ask Elaine, over coffee at the same diner she used to crave soup from during snowstorms, whether she thought there might ever be room in her life for me again, not as the man who had let her down, but as the man I was still working, every single day, to become. She did not answer right away. She sat with the question for a long moment, stirring her coffee though she took it black, the way people do when they need their hands to have something to do while their heart makes a decision their mind is still catching up to. Then she told me that she was not the same woman who had left our house with 2 suitcases years earlier, and I was, she hoped, not entirely the same man who had let her walk out that door without fighting for her. She told me she was willing to find out, slowly, carefully, without any promises beyond that day, whether the people we had each become separately might be able to build something new together, something that honored what we had lost rather than pretending it had never happened. I want to leave a little room here to ask you something, because I think this is the part of the story where your own reflections matter most. If you have ever had to face a truth about yourself that you had been avoiding for years, whether it cost you a relationship, a friendship, or simply your own peace of mind, I would love for you to share that in the comments. What did it take for you to finally stop running from it? Our community here has shared some of the most beautiful, honest reflections I have ever read in response to stories like this one, and I believe your experience might be exactly what someone else scrolling through today needs to read. Elaine and I did not rush into marrying again, though I think both of us, quietly, hoped that was where things were heading. We spent nearly 2 more years simply building, brick by careful brick, the kind of honest partnership we had never fully managed the first time. I learned, slowly and sometimes clumsily, how to leave work at the door when I came home, how to sit with her in silence when silence was what she needed rather than immediately trying to fix or explain or retreat. She learned, in her own time, how to trust that my presence was not going to disappear the moment things became difficult, that I had actually done the work rather than simply performed contrition for as long as it took to win her back. We eventually did marry again, nearly 3 years after that unforgettable afternoon in St. Augustine's Chapel, though this time we chose a much smaller ceremony, in the backyard of the house we had, by then, bought together, under an old oak tree that Elaine loved for the dappled light it threw across the grass in early afternoon. There was no veil this time, at her request, because she said she never wanted to give either of us the chance to hide behind anything again, not even lace. Wes stood beside me once more, older now, quieter in the way men become when they have watched a friend fall apart and slowly rebuild himself into someone steadier. My mother cried again, though this time the tears were, from the very beginning, tears of relief rather than shock. And in a gesture that still moves me every time I think of it, Priya sent a card that arrived 2 days before the ceremony, simple and handwritten, telling us both that she was glad, genuinely glad, that the truth she had insisted upon all those years ago had eventually led somewhere good, and that she hoped we would build the kind of marriage that made every bit of that painful honesty worthwhile. I think often about what would have happened if Priya had made a different choice that week before our wedding, if she had decided that honesty was too costly, that it was easier to marry the version of me who had learned to perform wholeness rather than the version who had actually done the work to become whole. I believe I would have gone on being outwardly successful and privately hollow, the way I had been for years already, and I believe Elaine would have gone on quietly wondering whether she had been wrong to hope, even briefly, that the man she once loved might someday reckon with what he had broken. Instead, because one woman had the courage to choose truth over comfort, even knowing it would humiliate her, devastate me, and shock 200 people gathered in a stone chapel expecting nothing more complicated than a kiss, all 3 of us ended up somewhere better than any of us could have engineered on our own. If this story touched your heart even a little, I want to ask you, before we close, to leave a meaningful comment below about what forgiveness and second chances mean to you, or about a moment in your own life when the truth, however painful in the moment, ended up leading you somewhere better than the comfortable lie ever could have. I read every single comment on our channel, and I promise you, the stories our community shares in response to moments like this one are often just as powerful as the stories themselves. These days, Elaine still teaches her classroom of 8-year-olds, and her windowsill is still crowded with dandelions in little paper cups, because some things, thankfully, never need to change. I still run my company, though I leave the office by 6 most evenings now, without exception, because I have learned the hard way what it costs to treat presents as optional. We still light the porch light every evening, an old habit I finally learned to keep, and some nights we simply sit out there together and talk about nothing important at all, which I have come to understand is one of the quiet, unremarkable miracles of a marriage that has finally been built to last. I do not know if every broken thing can be mended the way ours was. I do not think every story ends the way this one did, and I would never want to promise anyone false hope. But I know this much for certain, because I lived it, because I felt the floor disappear beneath me in front of everyone I loved and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, found my way to something more honest and more whole on the other side of that collapse. Sometimes the most devastating moment of your life is not the ending of your story at all. Sometimes it is simply the truth, finally arriving, exactly when you need it most, however painful its entrance, however unexpected its shape, however many tears fall from beneath a borrowed veil before the healing can finally begin. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the quiet, unglamorous work of second chances, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, leave your comment below, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Our family here grows because people like you choose, again and again, to believe that broken things can still be made whole. Thank you for walking through this story with me, and I will see you in the next one.